The American Revolution. A time when tea was high, yet it sunk so low. It all started when a little thing called the 7 Years' War took a big turn, and despite the Brits winning, they were largely in debt. The good thing was that the British had overseas colonies that they could tax for the reason that the war was for them. Here is when King George III decided it'd be a good idea to tax the colonies on these items, as displayed here. But the colonists just weren't happy. Due to this, colonists started to organize themselves and realized that they were being mistreated by the motherland. This wasn't because they couldn't tolerate the taxes, but rather that they didn't have representation in the British Parliament. Hence, it was unjust to tax them. This here is what is called the incubation stage in a revolution, from which the problems arise, yet no one has made a move. Then comes what is known as the symptomatic stage, where the people start to riot and form different writings that end up uniting the peoples of the revolution. Yet no full-scale war has started. Speed round. Some quite famous examples of these are the Boston Massacre, a revolt of colonists that quickly turned violent when British officials were having rocks and other objects being thrown at them by the locals, and in a sudden burst of confusion, shots were fired. There, 5 colonists died. The revolutionists used this story to publicize their cause: no taxation without representation. Now, with this news, the constant boycotting of goods, King George decided it might not have been a good idea to tax the colonists without representation. So like any good king would do, he terminated all the acts except for one, the Tea Act. Come on, George here is the king of England and practically the world. He couldn't let a couple angry mobs overthrow his rule of England and practically the world. Well, that's exactly what they did. Insert foreshadowing. To give King George the message that, hey, we want representation, they boycotted an entire shipment of tea in Boston. There, a group of revolutionists dressed up as natives ransacked the shipment of tea, letting it dissolve into the harbor. I still wonder if the harbors tasted like tea afterwards. As these revolts grew larger and more frequent, more and more people started to join this movement. Yet those who stayed loyal to the British were quite foul, one could say. This is how the fighting began, and it is considered the crisis stage. After British troops were being sent into Boston, they held the First Continental Congress on September 5th, 1774, where John Adams, John Jay, George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Dickinson were all present. Later, at future Congress meetings, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, not the musical, joined the fight. At first, they decided to give the British a simple message that was to stop. After that plan failed, somehow, they readied up their militias and their widely known Minutemen for what was going to come, the inevitable war. In response, Thomas sent 700 troops to Boston to attack the rebels in Concord. This is when the famous story of Paul Revere riding on his noble steed, calling out, "The British are coming," formed. Because of Revere, the rebels had the chance to ready up and fight them in Lexington. There, they sit across from each other waiting for the first shot to be fired, and then it happened. What is known as the shot heard around the world marked the first of many battles in the Revolution. There at Lexington, the rebels were forced to retreat due to the Brits' massive army, yet there was still hope, for when they got to Concord, other rebel troops joined and outnumbered the British. Due to this, poorly trained Minutemen were able to make the world's best army retreat in fear. After the battle at Lexington, rebels followed the British to Boston, and that is when the rebel forces surrounded the British defenses in Boston. Other battles took place as well, such as the one in New York when Colonel Benedict Arnold, foreshadowing traitor, and the Green Mountain Boys overtook Fort Ticonderoga. By doing so, they not only gave the British another embarrassing defeat, but they also got a hold of a massive quantity of guns and ammunition that they supplied the resources for the rebels that they did not have. To fight back, the rebels elected George Washington as commander-in-chief. As his first order of business, Washington rode up Boston to recapture it from British hands. This is when the Battle at Bunker Hill took place on June 17th, 1775. During this time, many fights broke out between the Loyalists, those who were still loyal to the British, and the Patriots, those who supported the revolts. At this time, while there were small fights here and there, other major fights occurred elsewhere. One such battle is when Benedict Arnold foreshadowing traitor, decided it'd be a good idea to invade Montreal in Quebec City in Canada. He was wrong because of his heartbreaking defeat, and he had to retreat from Fort Ticonderoga. After a long winter, George Washington was sent the excess guns and ammunition from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox. With these supplies, George Washington was able to lay siege onto Boston. They wanted to attack the British, yet the main route connecting the Boston to the land was heavily fortified, and George Washington changed plans and laid heavy artillery on Dorchester Heights. With no way counteracting these guns, the British were forced to retreat Boston, bestowing Washington with his first victory of the war. To accommodate for the future British attacks, Washington leads his troops in New York, knowing they'd probably lay siege there first. Then there lies one of the most famous pieces of literature and history called Common Sense, and it was written by Thomas Paine. He wrote it not because he didn't want to be feathered, but rather because he truly believed that the colonies should become independent from Britain. One should still remember that at this time, most people just want representation. But this was one of the first pieces of evidence that concluded that they wanted to leave their mother country's nest and become its own independent nation. Then came the drafting of and the acceptance of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. After some hard debating, Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the Declaration of Independence, which was later revised by the committee. Despite Jefferson writing, all men are created equal, with certain alienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he still had over 100 slaves, which is ironic. Then came July 2nd, where the Congress voted for the independence, which should be known as the greatest day in America. But then on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, which became the actual Day of Independence. Then, as time progressed, the Continentals had many difficult times, such as Burgoyne surrendering at Saratoga on October 17, 1777, and Washington's winter at Valley Forge, which lasted from December 19, 1777 to June 19, 1777. Despite these rough times, they showed other nations that they were a force to be reckoned with. In response, the French decided to help supply resources to overthrow British control by the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. This was ironic, for a monarchy was helping a republic overthrow another monarchy, which may or may have not been the reason for the inspiration of the French Revolution that lasted from May 5th, 1789 through November 9th, 1799. Then, as time went on, mutiny and treason were common within the armies, yet one person in particular truly hurt the revolution. That person was Benedict Arnold, who sought refuge in the hands of the British after his surrender a fort in West Point, New York. Speedrun. After the British defeat in Yorktown, the fighting stopped over the land and there lied conflict in the sea with the British. Due to some minor battles and loss of ships, it was decided that something had to be done. The Treaty of Paris was that something, and it was written on September 3rd, 1783. This treaty made Britain officially recognize the independence of the United States, and the distribution of land came into place for the United States. Yet in return, the United States needed to pay off any debt they owed to the British and had to stop mistreating the Loyalists. This here is what is called the covalent stage, as the war is over, yet there are side effects that are still in play. One of the previously mentioned was the Treaty of Paris, which gave land to several countries as a reward for negotiations. Other side effects that emerged from the Revolutionary War was the first election of the United States. George Washington was elected, and to this day has been the only election from which they had to not vote, but rather convince George Washington to accept the presidency. Rather than doing as many terms as he wanted, he only took 2 and established a cabinet of leaders, for he knew that no one person holds all the knowledge in the world. And this is how the president set up a precedent for future presidents. George Washington was initiated into his presidency on April 30th, 1789, becoming the first president of the United States, while still having one real tooth. Coincidence? I think not.